Hello, Scruffy Politics here. This is Steve, and I have a friend guest on, Brian. Brian wrote a book. It's called The Law and Men by Brian Krause. It's a good read. I read it. It explains clearly the laws. And Brian, would you want to explain the um, what this book is about?
Certainly, and thank you first of all for the nice introduction. And I'm thrilled that you read the book, and I'm thrilled that you enjoyed it. Obviously, you and I don't always see eye to eye on certain issues, so the fact that you enjoyed it was actually very important to me, and it meant that I accomplished some of what I was trying to accomplish. As you know, there are certain issues that I purposefully tried to avoid in the book. Not that I'm afraid to have a debate about some of those issues, but I wanted to focus on other things. So I'm thrilled that you read it and enjoyed it. The book, what prompted the writing of the book was I believe that for too long, certain authorities in our society who should know better feed on this kind of resentment of men. And this, of course, doesn't just hurt men. This hurts women. This hurts children. This hurts civilization in general. And I kind of wanted to address those issues specifically as it concerned the law.
Okay, nice. Yeah. And plus you're an attorney, so that helps a lot. And you provided plenty of resources in here, so if people did question it, they could look up the resources. So your first chapter, Law and History, can you kind of go into that?
Well, yeah, I think one of the biggest problems that we have these days is I think people weaponize history. And when certain individuals like myself try to provide some context, we're often accused of trying to cover up history. Or, for instance, when you talk about like race issues, for instance, there are those who say, well, you're trying to, quote, whitewash history. Now, this book, as you know, wasn't a book about race. It was mostly about gender, but some of the same themes apply. Uh, I find that a lot of times when people are addressing history, they're not trying to deal with certain issues in a way that enlighten and educate and help us all get along better. They're taking a tack to where they're trying to instill bitterness and resentment in people. And I know when it comes to issues of gender, I would see this throughout my entire education. I mean, the way this is done is that, again, certain authorities who I think should know better, they'll point out facts, but they'll point them out in a way without providing proper context and in a way that's meant to embitter people. And this has an impact on how we practice law in the present. And I gave some examples of that, as you recall, in the book.
Yeah. Can mention something you have in chapter one? Read a
Absolutely.
little part of it. So you mentioned how the uh, there's the Equal Rights Amendment (ERA), and Phyllis Schlafly, if I'm saying her name right. Um,
Schlafly. Hard to
okay,
pronounce. Yep.
yeah, Schlafly. Um, her campaign was called Stop ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, in the 1970s. Goes on to explain how the tendency of courts to favor women in child custody battles. So it explains how these privileges included, yeah, courts, social security benefits granted to the surviving widows. Three, the exclusion of females from mandatory military service, which they
Yep.
were granted. Men, when they were drafted, they were not granted that. Um, but
which exists to this day, by the way. To
oh
this day, I mean, I know there are some politicians trying to change that, but to this day, you men are subject to the draft, women are not. And there's reasonable reasons for that. I'm not suggesting that, we're certainly not blaming women for this, but yeah.
yeah, and um, I highlighted a part here. The ERA would have been a disastrous amendment to the U.S. Constitution and would have forced a rigid application of the concept of equality, quotes, on the courts and the law. Such an outcome would likely have led to absurd and impractical court rulings. Thus, we should all be grateful that the ERA was defeated. Yeah. Do
That's
you want to go
correct. Yep.
more into the ERA? Because I don't think a lot of people know about the ERA.
Certainly. Well, the Equal Rights Amendment, and it started, they tried to get it passed starting early in the 20th in the 20th century, yeah. In the beginning of the 1900s, they tried to get the ERA passed, and it made its way through the states, and it went down to defeat, I believe, in 1978 or 79. I don't remember exactly. But one of the points that I make in the book was that it wasn't just conservative women like Phyllis Schlafly who opposed it. Early in the century, there were a lot of progressive women who opposed it. And that was part of that reason was they were afraid that the ERA would make certain exemptions and protections that were afforded to women, that it would make those exemptions illegal. And they were not crazy for thinking that. So, when you get around to the 1970s, one of the big issues with the ERA is, as you recall, that was right around when the Vietnam War ended. I mean, it officially ended in 1975. And I think one of the biggest reasons it went down to defeat was the thought of women being drafted right after Vietnam, I think, was horrifying to a lot of people. And again, reasonably so. And to this day, you have, I think most people today probably would say that they support the right of women to serve in combat if they so choose. But I think there's a lot less support for the idea that they should be drafted into that kind of role. And if the ERA had passed, I think it would be the courts would have to apply a higher scrutiny to any kind of law that treated men and women differently. So I think the court would be compelled in many situations to strike down any law that had different requirements for men and women. And I think that would lead to bad things. That's my personal opinion on that. As you know, I tried to avoid giving my opinions as much in the book, but kind of just more setting up a framework for where some of these laws come from. But
yeah. What would now this might be a little bit of a stretch. So now you have with the gender issues nowadays, and there is a report in out of, well, there's two things that are kind of different. So let's go with the Naperville one first. There was a track race at middle school in Naperville, in which there was a boy who participated in the track race. I'm not sure if I guess he labels as transgender, so that's how he was able to run against other girls, and I guess he competed first. There was a bunch of outcry about that. I would think feminists would be against that, but it seems like feminists today would side with the boy. I'm just confused about this, And I know
some of them would.
I mentioned it in the book, but yeah. So
no, it's some of them would, and I didn't mention any of those issues in the book, but I'm happy to talk about it anyway. the some feminists would probably speak out against that sort of thing, but a lot of them would, I think, would also. Well, you see, for instance, someone like Megan Rapinoe, who's the U.S. women's soccer celebrity. From what I understand, she's been very supportive of trans individuals participating in women's sports, and I think where some of that comes from is feminists pushed for a long time the idea that men and women are basically the same, except for a few biological differences. So if you're going to take that position, it's very hard to now say, well, we have to exclude biological males from sports and whatnot. I mean, to me, it's shocking to me that this is even like a controversial political issue, because I think this is one of those things that should transcend right or left politics. I mean, the fact of the matter is you've got these biological men who, again, no ill will towards them, or any kind of, certainly don't support any kind of meanness or disrespect, but they're obviously biologically different than the women they're competing against. And it goes without saying that it's incredibly unfair that they'll get into these competitions and they'll just smoke these girls in races and everything else. So I think it's absurd. But no, I even though that's not in the book, I'm glad you brought that up, because philosophically I think some of these issues are related.
Yeah, and also in the book you mentioned how men and women are treated within the court system, and how it's actually more of a disadvantage towards men. And I think about this because I saw this in a news article a couple days ago. Out of Downers Grove, there was that former Downers Grove South teacher, Christina Formella, I think is her name. And
yes.
She appeared in court last week or 2 weeks ago, I think, and I think the prosecutor wanted her to stay in jail with no bond, but the judge let her go on, and like let her go. So whereas I think if it was a man who had a sexual intercourse affair with a student, it would be treated differently and more harshly. But this soccer coach and teacher or former teacher at Downer South, she was kind of treated with kid gloves at court, even though there are more counts of sexual misconduct against a minor. I just think the roles would be very different if it was a male teacher compared to, and she's an attractive teacher, of course, and, I think maybe it helped. And she was still, I saw online, in the yearbook at the end of the year. They did not take her out of the yearbook, even though this incident happened a long time ago. Or not a long time ago, but at the beginning of the school year.
So that's a very good and interesting point. And not to jump ahead too far, but as you recall in chapter 3, I point out that back in the day, statutory rape laws only applied to male perpetrators and female victims. And I think you're correct that women are treated much less harshly than men are. I provide a lot of data points for that in the book. I think that's indisputable. I will acknowledge, though, because I want to be intellectually honest, I will acknowledge that they are getting stricter with female perpetrators. I mean, back in the day, they'd rarely see jail time. I saw a case the other day, even with one of these women who's kind of attractive, and you think, oh well, she's not going to get punished very severely. She got a lot of time in jail, and I was kind of shocked by it. So I do think they're getting stricter with the women, but I do think you're right. There's a long history where they weren't, and part of the reason for that, when I've had conversations with other lawyers about this, I've had people respond to me that, well, it's not inappropriate to punish the male perpetrators more harshly because they're more dangerous. And, you could make, again, I mean, obviously I'm not biased against men. you could maybe make a rational case for that position. But I think what frustrates me is a lot of people are willing to acknowledge the differences between men and women when those differences portray men badly, right? So, I talked about in chapter 3, I talked about with the statutes related to sexual abuse, I talked about, there was some logic to this tendency to define these crimes in only a way that sanctioned male behavior. But if you're going to take that position, you've got to be consistent on it. It can't just be everything that portrays men badly. Then we accept men and women are different, but not in any other situation. So, but yes, for many years, as you recall in chapter 3, rape was defined in a way only a man could be guilty of the crime, only a woman could be a victim. And one of the statistics I point out is that men, for many, many years, through many different studies on this, men receive longer prison sentences than women do, and that includes white men. White men get longer sentences than black women do. So, it's not related to race or anything like that. Our criminal justice system punishes men much more severely than it does women.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. We will have another episode coming up soon. Thank you for coming on, Brian.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Hey.
The pleasure was all on this side of the computer.
Yes, here too. Okay.